Now joined by Kamran Bokhari in Toronto. He's a fellow with George Washington University's program on extremism and a senior lecturer at the University of Ottawa. Thank you so much for joining us.
Thanks for having me, Elaine.
I want to get your reaction to these reports that President Assad has called for parliamentary elections in April. What does that show?
That shows a defiant Assad, an Assad that is confident, relatively speaking. After all, with Russian help, his forces have taken away a lot of territory from the rebels in recent weeks and months. So, I mean, that just sort of shows that he is not willing to negotiate at this point.
Do you think this came as a result of this ceasefire? And want to get your thoughts on the Syrian opposition accepting the conditions of that ceasefire.
I think that the opposition is at a point where they've reached an impasse. The opposition, the Syrian rebels, the whole landscape, most of whom are Salafist jihadists, and I'm not talking ISIS or Jabhat al-Nusra, I'm talking the others. And so they've been at it for now 5 years almost. And so they've not made much headway. In fact, the territories that they took from the Assad regime have landed, most of them have landed back into the hands of the regime. In essence, they're squeezed by ISIS on one side and the regime on the other. So I think that they are probably engaged in a strategic review of their position.
Do you think the ceasefire will be effective? You know, we understand this is supposed to start at the weekend. This is something brokered by Russia and the United States. There was also supposed to be a ceasefire last week. So what kind of impact do you think this one will have?
Yeah, considering that this is the third interview that I'm giving you guys on the ceasefire, I'm not really hopeful. We've been talking about it, and the Americans and the Russians have been trying to broker it without much, success. I'm not putting my hopes on this one either. Maybe we'll have a lull in fighting, or what Secretary of State John Kerry calls the cessation of hostilities. Maybe that lasts a week, 10 days, 2 weeks, but eventually they'll go back to fighting.
But why do they seem to be more optimistic than ever before? The UN has come out and given its stamp of approval. John Kerry also being very optimistic about this particular ceasefire.
I mean, look, they're optimistic in a relative sense. They themselves, the language that they're using, they're being very cautious. They're not raising anybody's hopes. They have their fingers crossed as well in terms of how long this can last. But ultimately, the situation is as such that neither side has an imperative to seriously negotiate. So yes, there may be, time for recuperation for both sides as they see it. But this is not the end of the conflict. The conflict will go on for quite many years to come.
Well, and as we mentioned, that this does not include ISIL or the al-Nusra front. What does this mean, though, for Russia and the U.S.? They are still going to continue airstrikes against these groups. So how difficult would a ceasefire be to actually implement and then to monitor?
I think that ISIS is a separate case. Nobody was ever thinking that even with a ceasefire that there would be an end to fighting ISIS, and there shouldn't be, because it's not a negotiable commodity. But Jabhat al-Nusra is a strange actor, and the reason being is that the largest rebel group, Ahrar al-Sham, is allied with Jabhat al-Nusra. And Ahrar al-Sham is backed by the Turks, the Qataris, and the Saudis. And therefore, the question is that how can the United States continue to bomb Jabhat al-Nusra and not upset the relationship with its allies, Turkey, Saudi Arabia, and Qatar? Because on the battlefield, it's very messy. Different groups are allied with each other. And so it's going to be difficult to move forward with this ceasefire or cessation of hostilities.
All right, Kamran Bokhari in Toronto, thank you so much for your time.